Okami is an action-adventure game very much so similar to 3D Zelda. However, unlike Link, our protagonist, the wolf sun goddess Amaterasu, or Ami for short, is capable of moving fast and jumping high, which makes the game much more platforming focused, and lends itself to many platformer-esque tricks and sequence breaks. In addition to her movement capabilities, Ami also has the Celestial Brush, which is a mechanic that lets us pause the game at any time in order to turn the camera into a canvas that we can draw upon to do attacks and affect the world. This has the special property that we can force the camera to move independently of Ami, which allows us to do all sorts of sequence breaks that aren't possible without. This particular category is New Game Any %, and it basically just means beat the game from a new file. It's as opposed to New Game Plus Any %, which has been shown at past SGDQs, in that we don't possess access to Karmic Transformers, which lets us do the KT glitch, an infinite jump anywhere, which far simplifies the variety of sequence breaks in that category. Instead, we have to get a lot more creative by abusing the geometry in each area in order to make sequence breaks possible. We also don't have access to carried over weapons and items, which makes our combat require a lot more resource management and unique strategies. This particular version is the Switch version, but it's equivalent to any of the other 3 recent versions, the PC, PS4, and Xbox One version. Getting things started, we start with a 10-second initial load, and then we're immediately going to go into 3 story intro cutscenes, which total about 20 minutes. But fortunately, we can skip them all. The back of the book summary of this game is that we are the wolf sun goddess Amaterasu, and we're saving ancient Japan from the evil 8-headed dragon Orochi, although we're not actually going to do that in this run. We start off this tutorial segment by doing a tackle. This immediately gets us into dashing speed. Ami's walking speed is pretty slow, but when we have a dash, it's about 30% faster, and if we dash for about 5 seconds, it levels up into a second stage of dash, which is another 30% faster than that. The lower stage is called green dash, and the upper stage is called gold dash, and you'll see more of why that is later. You'll notice so far that I've been jumping into and out of each of these cutscene/dialogue triggers, and that's to do with a general technique called dash restoration or dash storage. It has a few different names. The important thing is that when we're airborne, Ami's level of dash is stored, and it's restored when we land, but we can actually split that up and have a cutscene between the jumping and landing, as long as after the cutscene we jump without moving. We can actually speed this up a bit by canceling our jump with a tackle and land immediately after jumping, getting an instant dash restore. You've already seen the first couple usages of the Celestial Brush, and here we're going to get something that's mostly irrelevant. It's the Astral Pouch. It basically gives us an extra life, but we try to avoid dying in this run. The Celestial Brush, as you saw, is letting us pause the game, and then we can draw on stuff, and depending on the patterns we draw, various effects are achieved. One thing to mention here is that Okami actually has 2 different camera modes. The camera can follow you at a close distance or a far distance, and we call those inner and outer camera modes respectively. The main difference between them is that the inner camera mode will actually follow behind Ami even if she turns, which makes it hard to go in a straight line, but does make it easier to turn at a steady radius. So in general, whenever we want to turn, we're usually going to be using inner cam, and whenever we want to go in a straight line, we're going to be switching to outer cam. Here we're getting our second Celestial Brush power. This is the most useful one, or one of the most useful ones, Power Slash. Simply draw a line to cut things. And then we're right away going to get into our first significant skip of the run. You saw there, we ran around a fight trigger. Well, you might not have seen it, because the fight trigger is pretty small, and obviously invisible, but take my word for it, we did just skip an entire fight. And we're actually going to skip another one right here. A lot of fight triggers in this game are actually kind of small, and it's easy enough to run around them, but there's also many which are only barely possible to avoid with the various techniques. And we'll see a few more of those later. And there's also, of course, many that we cannot avoid. You're going to see here I'm mashing the jump button in order to swim faster through the water. This is important in a few places because in most places where there's water, we're actually limited on how long we can swim before Ami drowns. And obviously, in some places, we can only barely make it across the distance we want without drowning, and that's only thanks to mashing jump. You'll also notice I'm pressing the bark button here. Yes, there is a dedicated button to bark in this game, and it basically just serves to bring up the HUD so that we can see how much money we have, how much health we have, and stuff like that. So that's the tutorial segment, and right now we're going to get into our first settlement of the game. This is Kamiki Village, and it is at the moment in a sort of half-cursed state. Isun won't let us leave the village or really progress in any way until we've examined the petrified villagers, which he presumes are just statues. So we are going to quickly go around talking to them. For this first one, we actually don't skip the dialogue, and this is in a couple places we're going to do something similar. In this game, we can either skip the dialogue or we can hold the X button on the Switch Pro controller in order to perfectly progress through the text as fast as possible. And whether one is faster than the other just depends on just how long the dialogue is. And for some very short dialogue, it is faster to simply progress through it with X instead of pressing start. Here we're going to get into our first actual fight of the run. These are going to be 3 green imps, and we're just going to use a single power slash through all of them twice, and that is enough to kill them. And you can see me jumping around here. This is to collect the ink pot that they drop on death. All enemies do this, and that allows me to restore ink, which lets me restore my dash. If Ami runs out of ink, she can't dash, which means if you move around at all without jumping, you'll lose your dash. We're going to start here with the Turnip digging minigame. This is part of the main quest, although we're technically not required to do this early, but this is the best time to do it anyway. So we're just going to get it done right away. All we have to do is dig up all 10 of these turnips without Mushi's mom slapping us, which basically just means we have to repeatedly power slash her to distract her. And then we bring this turnip all the way over to Mushi, and he takes us credit. And that's all we need to do. First, we're going to get this first treasure here. This is the only treasure we're going to be picking up in the entire run, and it contains an item called a small exorcism slip. Exorcism slips are basically battle items that attack every enemy in the entire battle, which is very useful. But we'll have to save them because they're kind of hard to come by. You'll notice that I couldn't skip that cutscene right away. In many cutscenes, you cannot skip them until there's dialogue, and in some cutscenes you cannot skip them at all because they have no dialogue. Although there's other types of cutscenes that you can skip, dialogue or not. And we basically just have to memorize which are which, although, you know, mashing the skip button doesn't really hurt, even if it doesn't do anything. There we saw Kushi. Kushi gave us some sake, some alcohol, to carry around. Not very responsible, but, you know, it's ancient Japan, what are you going to do? This fight introduces the red imp, which has an instrument that I can use to block attacks, and we just destroy the instrument with power slash. And then after the fight, Isun is going to give us a tutorial on a mechanic called praise. Basically, various things we can do in the game, mainly side quests, give us praise, which we can use to upgrade certain parts of Ami's abilities, mainly her health, the number of ink pots she has, the size of her wallet, and the number of astral pouches you have. The only two we're going to be using in this game, or in this run, are going to be upgrading ink, which is useful because it actually restores your ink fully, and upgrading our wallet, because we're actually going to need a lot of money later on in the run. Here we pick up the legendary swordsman Susanoo, but he's actually kind of not all he's cracked up to be, if that makes sense. He's sort of posturing. He's the descendant of the true legendary hero Nagi, but he doesn't have any deeds to his name, so we as the sun goddess are going to help him out here. So we're going to start with some training. Obviously he needs some alcohol to do his training, so that's why we got the sake. And we're going to start with a QTE segment, where we power slash these statues, or these dummies for him. However, here we're actually going to cut this rock, And this is actually a type of rock that we cannot cut by ourselves, and neither can Susanoo, so it's only through our combined abilities that we're able to defeat it. And the same goes for the boulder, which blocks the entrance to the village. This giant boulder is immune to our Power Slash by itself, but thanks to Susanoo's belief, we are able to bypass it. And with that done, we are out of the first area, Kamiki Village, and we enter into the hub area, Shinshu Field. The first of many. You can see it's covered by a bunch of black caviar. That is actually a cursed zone, which is similar to the cursed zone that afflicted Kamiki Village. But in this case, we're going to dispel it by restoring a tree, which unfortunately we don't yet have the ability to restore, so we are going to go to a side area. This is all intentional, of course, to Hana Valley, where we will get that ability. Now, Hana Valley is afflicted with its own curse, but fortunately we can progress a lot farther here than there. This is one of those cutscenes I was describing earlier where we cannot skip it. It's just a camera pan. This is the first fight of the area, the Campfire Fight, so to speak. There's actually a lot of enemies here, but just like with the other fights, we can kill many of them at once using Power Slash, since Power Slash is a multi-target attack. We're actually going to do a specific sequence of events here in this fight in order to make sure that we have full ink when these two red imps die. When you have full ink, as an enemy dies, the enemy will actually drop 200 extra yen, which is very important to the yen route, in order to make sure we have enough money for everything. These are just some hazards in the overworld, sort of corrupted cherry trees that throw fruit at us, but we can just run past them. Just a little cutscene here, unskippable. And jumping here, we are going to arrive at the first fight, which introduces the Yellow Imp. And this is where we are actually going to use our small Exorcism slip. The Yellow Imp is normally quite an annoying enemy to defeat, especially without an ability that we'll be getting later. But by saving our small Exorcism slip for this fight, it actually saves a lot of time where we'd otherwise have to wait for a certain random pattern from the Yellow Imp in order to kill it quickly. After that, we're just going to progress further down the area. Here, Isun interrupts us to bring our attention to this sort of sapling, this sprout. And once again, we're going to hold the fast text button rather than skipping the dialogue. Here, I actually mess up the brush recognition. This is sort of a common theme. You wouldn't expect, especially for a game from 2006, to have perfect, what is basically handwriting recognition in a simplified form. So occasionally the game will mess up on us and not recognize the brush technique we wish to do, or recognize an incorrect brush technique. Once again, we have Susanoo with another QTE segment. Just have to destroy these torches, and then we're going to attack this bear for no reason. Attacking the bear causes it to fall off the ball, and then this is probably one of the most obnoxious segments in the run. Pushing this ball is quite annoying because it has very finicky physics, to put it lightly. It likes to go off in the entirely wrong direction from where we want to put it. It tries to like stick to us sometimes, but other times it'll roll right around us. Very strange, and moving it quickly is a bit of a skill. And keep in mind, that was very suboptimal, what you just saw. This ball isn't just a ball, it is a magical growth crystal which concentrates sunlight in order to grow vegetation at rapid speed. And this unlocks for us the next celestial brush technique, Bloom. And that lets us restore this big cherry blossom, the Guardian Sapling, it's called, which itself then dispels the cursed zone around Hana Valley. Coming up here, we're actually going to skip a repeat of the Yellow Imp fight from before. And this is actually very helpful because we only had one of those small exorcism slips. So if we had to do the fight again, it would sort of defeat the point since we'd have to do the slow strategy anyway. But we're just barely able to get around that fight trigger. Isun tries to get us to do a few extra things now that we have Bloom. It can also restore cursed patches on the ground. But we avoid doing that. And there's also a repeat of the Campfire Fight, which we can just run around. No special jumping necessary. And that completes Hana Valley. One thing you'll notice as we load into Shinshu Field is that we're actually going to tackle again. This is because you cannot store dash through loading zones. At least not true loading zones, where the map changes. So anytime the map changes, we have to start with a tackle and build gold dash from the ground up. So now that we've healed Shinshu Field, it is now in an uncursed state, which means we can progress further. The first thing we are going to do is go to this merchant right over here, because we need a couple of new battle items. Unlike the first battle item we used, the small exorcism slip, the one we just picked up, the Steel Fist Sake, which we got 2 of, doesn't just do damage, it actually increases the attack power of Ami's attacks, as well as of a specific brush power that we'll be getting in a few minutes. And this is very helpful later on. The Steel Fist Sake are a lot cheaper than Exorcism Slips, which makes them a lot more usable in various fights. And there are various enemies which are much more resistant to Exorcism Slips than to the powers we'll be using with the Steel Fist Sake. Here we're actually starting a side quest. This isn't required by any means, but the tutorial of the side quest turns it to night, which we need it to be night in order to progress further. Here, basically the minigame is, in various random places around Shinshu Field, there will be named enemies, and we defeat them. They have a bit more health than their normal counterparts. This is a Red Imp wanted enemy. And then once it's defeated after the fight, Isun is going to make us cross out its name from a list. Now, which of the named enemies you get is random, but the order of the names on the list isn't. So this is one of the only times in the game where we actually have to be able to read the text. So we have to read the name of the enemy. In this case, it was lucky it was actually the middle enemy on the list. Here I actually mess up my movement a bit. We don't have enough breath to just swim across this gap, so we start with a jump. So you can see I'm mashing the jump button in order to just barely make it across this before my breath gauge runs out. And here we're going to run into yet another scripted fight. The green scroll things you see flying around are optional fights. They're demon scrolls, and we try to avoid them, although they will try to chase us when it's nighttime or when we're inside hidden areas. This enemy that was introduced with this fight is the Dead Fish. It's similar to Green Imps, except it takes 3 power slashes to defeat instead of 2. And then this is the reason why we needed night. We can't go into this house until it's nighttime, because this is the home of Yama, the pyrotechnician, and he's going to give us a new ability, the ability to create explosives. This celestial brush technique is known as Cherry Bomb. And this is the ability I was referring to, which is powered up by the Steel Fist Sake. Makes sense that explosives would get stronger with alcohol. Here you're going to see I actually get caught by the Demon Scroll. This is not, you're not intended to do this obviously, but I was just a bit too close to its aggro range. And fortunately, all optional fights we can escape by simply attacking the barrier until it breaks. And then this is going to be the first major sequence break of the run. We're intended to go back to Kamiki Village at this point in order to earn another brush technique called Water Lily, which lets us make platforms on the water. which we are supposed to need in order to jump out of the water onto a platform at the end of this cave. However, there's a glitch in this game called the corner glitch, which lets us jump out of the water whenever there's a sufficiently acute angle. So we can use that, get a wall jump, and then get an air tackle onto this ledge here, skipping several minutes of blooming various trees in Kamiki Village. And that lets us progress directly to the next area, Agata Forest. Agata's Guardian Sapling, and every cursed area has a Guardian Sapling, is actually right underneath where we start. So we just have to jump down, go into this waterfall, the tunnel behind the waterfall, and at the end of the tunnel, we can blow it up with a cherry bomb, and there's the Guardian Sapling. Very quick, but that's the easy part. Once we load into the healed Agata Forest map, we're going to run directly out of the tunnel and into another unavoidable fight trigger. This fight introduces one of the major side characters in the game, Waka, who will follow us throughout our journey, and unfortunately we cannot skip his encounters here. So this is going to be our first usage of Steel Fist Sake powered cherry bombs. We're going to draw a cherry bomb and then push it into him or let him walk into it. As a human, he's quite vulnerable to explosives. You will notice I did get hit during that fight, and during the results screen here, you'll see I didn't get the maximum possible bonus. If you get hit at all during pretty much any fight, you'll lose your yen bonus, which lets you earn more money from fights. And this can negatively impact the yen route, but it's lenient enough that it's not a big deal if we miss a couple fights early on. You can also lose yen bonus from taking too long in the fight, but obviously we almost always avoid that. Here we're going to go fishing with a boy named Kokari. He actually has no fishing line, so we're going to draw his fishing line for him. Now, fishing is kind of an RNG minigame. We're intended to sort of balance how hard we're pulling in order to avoid burning Kokari's stamina. If he ran out of stamina, he would just fall into the lake and we would have to start over. However, the scripted fishing minigames are short enough that there's really no risk of running out of stamina, so we just go full tilt. The fish you get are semi-random. There's different sized shadows for the different fish, but which fish spawn is random. But the last fish, the third fish, is always fixed because it's part of the scripted fishing sequence. And this would be the giant salmon. So the important thing about this salmon is that it has swallowed the key to the game's first dungeon, which in this game would be Tsuta Ruins. So after that cutscene, we load back into Agata Forest. And now we have the key in our mouth, which is actually shaped sort of like a teardrop, although you can't exactly see it. One downside about holding things in your mouth is that you cannot bark. Ami will not bark even if you press the button while you are holding something. And unfortunately, tossing something in order to bark can be risky in some cases, so we're not going to do it here. So that opens up the dungeon. And we're going to hop right in after our companion Isun gets a little word in. Isun's very talkative, but fortunately we can skip most of his dialogue. Here we're going to actually do a pretty big skip. This skips an 18-second unskippable cutscene, which sort of just shows a camera pan over the whole dungeon. And then we're immediately going to get into this. Tsuta Ruins is actually, surprisingly, one of the least broken dungeons in the game. Just because our ability set is quite limited and the geometry is really big in this map particularly, which makes it hard to sequence break between areas, but there's still going to be a few relatively minor tricks and one big one at the end. Right here we're going to have a new enemy. This is the Bud Ogre. And they're kind of interesting in that they have a sort of multi-step process to defeating them. First we can send it flying with a cherry bomb, then we need to attack it twice to get it to fall over. Then we need to use Bloom in order to make it open up and become actually vulnerable. And then we can finally truly attack it and hurt it. There I got a health restoring item. Every time you obtain an item for the first time, you get a text box. Some things we can avoid, but for health restoring items that drop from just about every enemy, we can't do it. Here there's another ball pushing puzzle, but if you remember the first one, we don't like ball pushing puzzles. So we're actually going to try to skip it. I mess it up here, but I give it another go. You can simply draw a cherry bomb on the switch at the end, and it'll open the door just the same as the actual ball would. And as long as we get through the door before the bomb explodes, we're good. Then right away we actually get into a very similar fight. This is with 2 Bud Ogres instead of 1. So we're actually going to use our Steel Fist Sake here, and that's specifically so that we can use just a cherry bomb to make them vulnerable without having to attack them twice. And then we're going to deal a little bit of damage to each of them just so we can get the damage values just right, and a cherry bomb will defeat them. And whenever you defeat an enemy with a cherry bomb, the yen it drops flies everywhere. Here we're going to do one of the first skips in this dungeon. This is a mushroom skip. We're actually going to get onto this log here. I clip into it on accident, but it's not a big deal. And that lets us do a cool bit of platforming to get up here. What you're intended to do is do sunrise in order to make the mushrooms on that log grow into big platforms. But we can skip that, saving a few seconds. Here, this is the collapsing bridge, very ominous. We're actually going to run directly into a dialogue trigger. Normally, when you run into dialogue or cutscenes, Ami will do a braking animation, which causes her dash to be lost, so that you have to start with a tackle again. But some specific dialogue triggers will automatically set Ami to be in a standing animation, which lets us basically skip having to jump into them. Here is Blockhead. This is one of the things that sort of blocks a progression in the dungeon. We just have to draw 2 dots on him, and he'll explode. And then he produces this key, and we just have to take the key back to the top of the room. We do some interesting platforming here to avoid having to go up those very narrow logs, which are quite difficult to actually stay on top of. And this brings us to the Lockjaw. Locked doors in this game are actually living enemies that we kill by shoving the key, which is actually an arrow, through their eye. And here's a bridge which we use Rejuvenation on to bring it back. Rejuvenation being the first brush technique we obtained. And here's one of the more notorious rooms in the run. This is the Triple Devil Gate room. These gates here are Devil Gates. We've seen them before, but we never went through one. They're just scripted fight sequences that usually have multiple enemies in them. And there's 3 of them here, which means lots of opportunities for things to go wrong in the fights. So this fight is 2 red imps and then a Bud Ogre. So we do our best to hit multiple enemies at once with the cherry bombs, but there's a limit to just how much we can do. Red imps can fortunately be defeated just by a single cherry bomb. So after the first gate, we just go straight into the second, one after the other. This one is similar to another fight. This is 2 green imps and a yellow imp, and this is where we finally start fighting the yellow imps for real. We can simply use ink on it in order to make it vulnerable to Cherry Bomb, and then we use Cherry Bomb, and then we Power Slash it. And here's another dead fish, just takes 3 Power Slashes. And we can sort of bend our Power Slash in some cases, and still have it recognized as a straight line, which lets us, in some cases, hit multiple enemies where otherwise it'd be impossible. The enemies you get from each fight are fixed. However, the positions they spawn in are actually random, so they can spawn pretty much anywhere in the fight arena, and we call this form of RNG spread. It's not a huge factor, but being able to deal with different spawn patterns is a skill you develop, and some spawn patterns are faster and easier than others. Once we've defeated all of those Devil Gates, these poison pots appear, and we just have to draw a Power Slash through all of them, there's 5, in order to destroy them. And we actually do a camera setup, which allows us to use the top of the screen as an alignment tool in order to draw a single straight Power Slash through all 5 pots, although you can't see them. So then we just simply jump down, and now that we've unpoisoned the water in the ruins, we can go to the giant statue at the center of the first room, which we couldn't reach before. Inside this statue, there is a set of 3 cursed patches, which we simply have to draw circles on top of in order to restore. The critical factor here is that we just have to put down enough ink over the cursed patch. It doesn't matter whether we cover it properly or not, but doing small circles is the fastest way to achieve that. And then this gets us our next brush power. This is one of the more interesting ones. This is Vine. And Vine is basically like a hook shot. As long as there's a pink flower, we can draw a line between it and Ami to bring her towards it. And as you'd expect with a hook shot like item, it can be quite broken. And we're going to start with that literally right away by doing our first brush adventure. Basically, this is where we bring the brush far away from Ami and clip it through the ground. This lets us get a long-ranged vine, which lets us clip through this platform and get out of bounds. And then conveniently, in this game, a lot of unrelated rooms are stored on top of each other. So, by falling out of bounds in the precise manner, we can get to the final room in the dungeon right away. Now, this doesn't save as much time as you'd think, because there's actually not that much of the rest of the dungeon between these two places, but it does save like 18 to 20 seconds. So, quite a substantial skip. And very cool looking. That one is called Cookie Clip, after the person who discovered it, Giant Cookie Jar, who actually discovered a lot of major sequence breaks in this run. This is a golden gate. It's basically a autosave point. As long as you run through it, if you die, you can load back from there. But we're going to jump around it to avoid a tutorial text box. This is our first boss, the Spider Queen. We simply have to draw 2 vines to her abdomen, the hooks on it, which splits her open, which reveals the eyes inside her abdomen, which are her weak point. Yes, we have eyes for weak points, although she's the only one. This is only the first boss, so we're not going to copy that trope the whole time. So we do a special pattern there where we use the ink restore at the end in order to make sure we have full ink so that we can do enough power slashes through all of her eyes in order to defeat her in a single cycle. So now we have 5 ink pots as opposed to the 3 that we started with. Here we could go to the left right away and progress further. However, we're going to take a bit of a detour in order to activate a fast travel point that we'll be using later. We can't use the fast travel system in this game just yet because we have to obtain a mermaid coin, but we'll be getting a mermaid coin relatively soon in order to start using it. This game does have a fair amount of backtracking over its relatively large world, so being able to teleport across to different parts of the map is very helpful. So you'll notice I just went up to the lake there, and then I doubled back immediately. All you have to do is get a certain distance to the mermaid spring, to the lake, and it'll automatically activate the fast travel point. Here we have a bit of a minigame here. This is the log bridge minigame. We just have to wait until the flowers appear on either side, and then we draw a vine from them to the hooks on this log. It would actually be quite nice if we could simply jump across this river or swim across it. However, the river is actually fast rapids, and if you try to swim across it at all, Ami will immediately drown and get pulled away. There is a way to skip this river in other categories, mainly in New Game Plus, but unfortunately it's just barely out of reach within this category, although it would save around 3 to 5 minutes if it were possible. After that, we can progress to the next major area. This is Taka Pass, yet another cursed area. Just about every place we're going to go is cursed in one way or another. And we're going to start with the first big shopping trip of the run. We've been saving up money up to this point, and we actually can sell the fish that we fished up earlier before to the ruins. And that gives us enough money to buy 4 meat feed bags, a medium exorcism slip, a large exorcism slip, and a few steel fist sake. So at the beginning of the run we got a small exorcism slip, but there's also medium and large ones which have the same effect but do more damage. And you can imagine how those would be helpful. However, of course, they're very expensive, so we tried to limit our usage of them to only when it would count the most. This here is a re-encounter with our good friend Waka, so he's pestering us yet again. But we're going to take the exact same approach to him as the first time, explosives. However, this time he has a bit more health, so it takes 4 instead of 3. But very fortunately we have 4, or actually 5 ink pots now to deal with it. So, done relatively quickly. After the fight, we go up this big spiral bridge. And there's a relatively low-key segment here, where we're just going to move across a relatively large distance through a tunnel in order to reach the Guardian Sapling. It would, in theory, be faster to run back out the way we came and bloom the Guardian Sapling from below, but the game actually checks Ami's position to make sure you're up on this plateau here. And I actually run into yet another optional encounter, which slows things down, but that's just the way things are in a relatively rusty run. It is worth mentioning, this run is not the world record, but this is the best time yet with the newest route, which in theory saves 3.5 minutes over the current record, but, you know, it's a relatively new route, so we haven't had time to get used to all the new tricks yet. But this is by far the closest to what I would be doing in the future. And it is the optimal route. So having bloomed the Taka sapling, this is actually where we get into the new route changes since the current world record. Normally, previously, we would have been locked into a day-night cycle at this point because blooming the sapling sets it to a certain time of day, and we need it to be night for one of the things we have to do next. And everything other than that we can actually get done before it turns night. So we would be just waiting for around 40 seconds at the end here. However, thanks to a new trick, we can skip the thing that previously forced us to wait for it to be night, saving several minutes. Around 3.5, like I said. First we start with actually a sort of side questy thing. We have to attack these molsters, very unfortunate name. Don't try to spell it out. It's because they stole some guy's teacup. So we have to return this golden teacup to the tea master. And in exchange for the teacup, the tea master will give us a golden mushroom. And we're later going to get into just what that golden mushroom does, but it's basically just a trade quest. A very short one. After returning the teacup, we're going to go right back the way we came and towards a devil gate, another one, and this one is to set up yet another fast travel point, which we'll be using actually multiple times later in the run. I'm trying to get up this slope here. Wall jumping up slopes can be kind of finicky. The game sometimes doesn't let Ami get close enough to the wall in order for a wall jump to register. This fight is pretty regular. It's just a Bud Ogre and then a Yellow Imp. Both enemies we've seen before, so nothing terribly special. We did actually get a new weapon from the Spider Queen, a direct upgrade to the weapon we have on our back right now, which is a divine instrument, a type of divine instrument called a reflector, and this particular variation is called Divine Retribution. The one we got from Spider Queen is called Snarling Beast, and it's a little bit stronger, but unfortunately it's not strong enough relative to what we have in order to save any time, so we don't ever bother taking the time to equip it, even though we'll have it in our inventory for the whole run. So we're going to do almost the entirety of this run with the weakest enemy, with the weakest weapon in the entire game. After that, we're going to go directly to Sasa Sanctuary. Now this is where the new trick comes in. We're intended to save a girl named Chun, who's actually a sparrow, part of the Sparrow clan, and the Sparrow clan have locked up their inn because their daughter was kidnapped. So we have to return their daughter in order to have them let us into the inn so that we can progress. However, we're actually going to do a interesting trick here, not too dissimilar to Cookie Clip that we did before. in order to get into the inn early. So we can't go through the front gate, we can't clip through it in any way, and we can't go over it because it's very tall. So instead we're going to sort of, in an abstract way, go under it. Now, interiors in this game, much like the separate parts of Tsuda Ruins, are actually stored underneath the corresponding overworld map. So if we can get out of bounds, we can fall into the interior part of the map, which is actually stored way, way below. So as long as we fall a certain distance, we simply have to wait above where we know the map is, and we can fall directly into it. So now we're inside, we have broken into Sasa Sanctuary against the will of the sparrows. And they'll just let us progress like normal, because they don't know any better. So that saves a lot of time. Unfortunately, Chun does get eaten, but, you know, only so much we can do when the objective is to defeat evil as fast as possible. This is our first and only digging minigame. We actually have to help Mr. Bamboo, this old guy here, get to the bottom of this sort of side-scroller area, so that he can help us dig up the source of water to the spring, which has gone dry. So this inn has some hot springs. Very typical of ancient Japan. So we can draw a circle on him to make him run a bit faster, but it's not too helpful since it takes time to do that. So we just dig once he gets to the bottom. We have to wait for him to find the spot. He always finds the same spot. We know where it is. We're just waiting for him to point it out, because the game won't let us do anything otherwise. And this unveils our next brush technique. This is Water Spout. We can draw a line from any water source onto various other objects in order to draw water to them, like this. So I actually missed here. I'm supposed to draw water onto this burning bird in order to put him out. And we can actually draw lines up from certain spots in the water to make a pillar rise out of the water like a geyser. And we're going to use that a couple times later in the run. This technique is actually hard required in multiple places in the rest of the run, so there's no way we can skip it, unlike with Water Lily, which we skipped earlier. And there are going to be a couple other brush techniques we skip in the run, but for the most part, we're not going to be skipping too many of them, because many of the brush techniques are hard checked for at the end of the game. So we talk to this bird, and this produces a sort of floating thing you can see in front of us. This is the Canine Tracker. We're actually not supposed to have obtained this yet, but because we're doing the sequence break, the game assumes we already have it, so it just gives it to us. And this lets us encounter the first of 8 dogs that we'll be finding in this run. This one is named Take, not Take, Take. And he is quite annoying. So we have to fight 4 dogs in this run, and Take is one of the worst. He likes to jump around a lot, which makes him very hard to hit with cherry bombs, and that's the fastest way to defeat him, with 3 cherry bombs. In this case, he's doing an attack that gives him super armor, so he actually absorbed one of our bombs, but we were still able to do the fight relatively quickly. So at the end of this fight, you can see I build Gold Dash with the downtime, and then I jump while barking. Whenever there's a results screen dialogue up that tells you how well you did in the fight, if you mash A or start, A being the bark button, it actually clears the results screen about 1 second faster. So we bark a lot on this run, and it is actually optimal. Here we're going to get our first mermaid coin, the fast travel token that I mentioned earlier. And we can use this fast travel point, this mermaid spring, in order to teleport out of Sasa Sanctuary. We can't actually leave Sasa out of the front entrance because it's still locked, even though we broke in from above. So this is the only way out of the sanctuary. So it's very fortunate that there's a fast travel point here, right where we need it. So we go directly back to Taka Pass, and now we're going to pretty much progress fairly normally through the rest of this area, but with some extra sequence breaks enabled by the big sequence break we just did. Just a relatively long straight path. So Kusa Village is suffering from its own cursed zone, but this cursed zone is unique from the others. It completely blocks us from using ink, but it doesn't hurt us otherwise. So we have to go find the cause of this cursed zone, and unlike the others, it is not caused by a tree. Instead, it's caused by some demons. So we just take a fast path through the village while our ink is drained. We want to get to the end of the village before our ink completely drains, because it avoids a cutscene later. But fortunately, that's pretty easy. It's quite hard to run out of ink here. So this is Princess Fusei. She's afflicted by a curse. And we're just going to use our large exorcism slip to defeat all the enemies in one go. We can't use our brush here because it's still cursed, so even though these enemies normally would be pretty easy to defeat with brush techniques, it's just a lot faster to defeat them with the exorcism slip. And so now that we've freed Fusei from her curse, she's going to give us the Canine Tracker that we actually had earlier, but we're only supposed to obtain now. So we're actually supposed to have done this segment earlier, before we went to Sasa Sanctuary. So the objective here is to find the 4 dogs in Kusa Village, and feed all of them meat, so that they will return to Princess Fusei, and be the canine warriors, and give her the power to unlock the next dungeon. So this is 1 out of 3, that's Ray. And then here we're actually going to go and meet Mr. Bamboo, the guy we helped to dig in the Sasa Sanctuary. So he's back here again. Then the camera wigs out, and then here's another dog hiding in bamboo this time. They're all really trying hard to get out of their sworn duty to protect. So we feed this one, and then we're going to do an important trick here. This is a trick called Shin Warp. This saves about 10 seconds, and this is yet another brush adventure where we're going to be dragging the brush camera far away from Ami, breaking its normal boundaries. And this, we abuse the fact that certain cutscenes will teleport Ami because they assume you're going to be in a certain place, so they just put you in a scripted location. But we can use this to teleport past another cutscene trigger that we'd normally have to go through. And this reveals the 3rd dog, Shin. Now, I did say we had to feed 4 dogs here. However, because we already fought one of the dogs outside of Kusa Village, the game thinks we've already fed an extra one when we arrive in Kusa Village. So at this point, even though we've only fed 3 of them, the game thinks we've fed 4, so it triggers the next sequence, assuming that we fed all the dogs. And we're actually going to abuse this in a moment. But first, we have to do the thing the game intends us to do, which is to fight what is supposed to be the first dog fight. Here is Tay. He is the weakest dog because he can only take 2 cherry bombs instead of 3. And he also has a much more limited patterns, so he's a lot easier to deal with. Much less RNG in this fight than with the other dogs. So, same strategy as before. Use a Steel Fist Sake, draw a cherry bomb, and push it into him. And we just run around barking over his defeated corpse. He's not really dead though, he's just playing dead. So right here, we fed 3 of the 4 dogs, but the 4th dog is here, assuming that pretending that we fed it. So we're actually just going to go to a certain position so that we can feed the specific dog we want. And then because the game assumes we're supposed to feed this dog in a certain location where it normally is, it teleports us there as if we had fed it earlier. And then the camera flies back to Fusei because it tries to find the dog, but it's not in the right location. And that trick is called Meat Warp because we use a meat feed bag to teleport. And mainly the purpose of that is to leave Kusa Village a bit faster since it teleports us close to the entrance here. I actually draw a sunrise there. That's one of the first powers we got, just to turn it day. Like I mentioned before, Devil Scrolls or Demon Scrolls will only chase you during the night when you're in an overworld area. So this avoids us having to run around a couple Demon Scrolls that would otherwise slow us down. Night in this game is only 2.5 minutes compared to day being 6.5. So we would actually have to see a day-night transition anyway. so it doesn't lose much time to draw Sunrise there. So at this point, we're actually supposed to, like I said, find another 2 dogs. If you've been counting, we've encountered 5 of the 8 canine warriors. Sorry, 6. So there's 2 left. However, we're actually going to do the first of a few major sequence breaks. This is actually one of the biggest ones in the entire run. We can go to this area normally, and the game is sort of teasing you here. Like, there's this giant bridge that's raised, and you have to lower it, but you have no means to do that yet. And otherwise, there's just this giant gorge with a river, and like, how are you supposed to cross the gorge without the bridge? Well, the devs didn't anticipate that we would get creative. And by creative, I mean incredibly obstinate, because this is actually one of the hardest tricks in the entire run. So we're going to be mashing jump here to swim across this river, and the river actually has a current on it, so it's actually a longer distance than it seems, because we're constantly being pushed downstream and have to swim back up. Then we do a complicated platforming sequence to get onto the top of this rock here, and if we land precisely on the tip of it, we can do a grounded tackle jump, which slides us off into the air, which we can then cancel into a ground jump, into a wall jump, into an air tackle bounce, which lets us get onto the other side of the cliff. And believe it or not, that trick is way harder than it looks. I got it first try there, which is lucky. But the first time I ever did that trick, it took me 5 hours of attempts. And I've had many hours of practice since then. So now, we've actually skipped a huge segment of the game. If you're familiar with the game, we've skipped the entire part of the run, or of the story, where we're supposed to fight Orochi, who's actually the first big evil guy of the run. It's the entire end of the first chapter out of 3. We just skip it entirely and go immediately into the second chapter. Here we do another camera clip. We clip the camera through the ground this time, and we can then draw a water spout all the way to the top of this sequence of lakes, skipping the 2 lakes in between. And just by coincidence, doing that actually lets us gain control during the cutscene, but it's useless, so we just put up the overlay map and then bark a bunch, because we have nothing better to do at that time. And now we have bloomed the Ryoshima sapling. So that particular camera clip, that saves about 20 seconds versus doing it normally. And then here we're going to do pretty much the second time that we're actually going to clip Ami herself out of bounds after a cookie clip. So this is the first time we're doing it completely unassisted without the help of a vine or something. There's actually a tiny hole in the geometry of this map, which lets us go right under these stairs, and then we can jump down and do something similar to what we did in Sasa Sanctuary. We're going to fall directly into an interior map in the overworld. However, unlike in Sasa, the interiors in most maps are actually not stored underneath the corresponding house on the overworld. So this interior belongs to the dojo, which is actually really far southwest of where we were. But it's stored up here because it's actually supposed to be stored next to the origin point of the map. Just a little convenient thing there that lets us avoid having to travel a far distance. Here we're actually buying the first and only dojo technique we obtain in this run. There's a bunch of different techniques you can buy here to improve Ami's abilities in combat and stuff. But the only one that's required is double jump. So this lets us do a mid-air jump, which obviously, as you can imagine, is incredibly useful, not just for intended things, but for skips. And so we're going to get very quickly into what kind of skips having a double jump enables. We start by double jumping to get a bit faster over this water. In general, swimming is pretty slow, so we try to double jump over water whenever we can to avoid having to actually swim in it. Then here we're going to do a fight skip. This fight trigger is actually really huge, but it's just barely possible to go all the way around it. And it's going to look like nothing here, but I have to hug this cliff in order to avoid the trigger. And that brings us directly into Seian, the capital of ancient Japan, or Nippon, if I want to use the in-game terminology. So Seian is home to what we like to call the Gauntlet. There's several tricks right after the other, and all of which can lose you a lot of time because they're easy to mess up. We start with a trick called Early Fireburst. Seon, as you can see, is afflicted by a curse zone, and actually any houses that are inside the curse zone are just invisible. They don't appear, so we can't enter them. However, the interiors are still located under the map, so by doing this complicated platforming sequence, we can get out of bounds and do yet another interior clip, this time going into the interior of the restaurant of Seon. And in this restaurant is actually a part of a side quest that we started earlier. If you remember the Molsters and the teacup we gave to the tea master, who gave us a golden mushroom, and then we can give the golden mushroom to this guy, Yama, and Yama will give us a new brush technique called Fireburst. We draw an infinity sign and it makes a big ball of fire appear. This is actually an optional upgrade. There are several upgrade techniques in this game, which are variations of like base elemental techniques that let you use certain elements in new ways, and this is one of them. Normally, the base technique for fire is Inferno, which requires a fire source in the same way that Water Spout requires a water source. However, Fireburst doesn't require a fire source, and more importantly, it doesn't actually require Inferno. So the game sort of tells you that it's an upgrade technique, but you can get it without having to get the base technique as long as you do the right sequence breaks. And that's exactly what we do here, because we're not going to get Inferno. To get Inferno would actually take about 30 minutes, or closer to 25, and it's part of the dungeon that the entire full dungeon that we skipped by doing the city checkpoint skip earlier. Here I'm trying to do a trick that lets us skip another few minutes of gameplay. This guy here, Benkei, has lowered the bridge and split it up, so we can do instead a sliding ground tackle in order to get onto the raised segment of the bridge, completely skipping a digging minigame and a fishing minigame. It's like 3 or 4 minutes long. He just walk again. He's not going to fight us, but he is going to interrupt us. And then here is Rao skip. So in that building there is a girl named Rao, who we normally have to talk to and help out a bunch, but we can just go around her building by going through some very narrow geometry there. And then right up here is Himiko's palace. So Himiko is the queen of Japan, and normally we'd have to do yet another, actually 2 or like 1.5 dungeons in order to get into the palace, but just by tackling the guard in a certain way there, we can get past them and they won't throw us out of the palace, letting us get in early. Normally they would block you until you have another brush technique called Veil of Mist, which lets you slow down time, but this is one of the things that lets us skip Veil of Mist completely. And we are already less than an hour into the run. We are in Himiko's palace, which is normally one of the later, or like the midpoint of the second chapter of the game. So we skipped a huge segment of the run just by doing all those tricks we just had to do in Seon. But here you'll notice I'm up here, but there's a bunch of lava. Now I can't exactly explain why Himiko has decided to fill the top floor of her castle with lava, but she has. And unfortunately we can't swim through lava. We're intended to get an item called the lava tablet, or the fire tablet, which would let us swim through lava. However, we're going to skip that because that would take about 20 minutes to obtain. Instead, we're going to do an incredibly precise sequence of jumps over this lava. It's just barely possible if we do multiple frame perfect jumps in a row in order to get over this lava and reach the other side. And you can see I'm actually failing it multiple times because it's just that precise that there's no consistent setup. You'll see that I'm actually using the brush to sort of buffer my actions. However, it's not like pause buffering in Ocarina of Time where you can do frame perfect actions with it. The brush buffer only advances 2 frames at a time instead of 1, and this is a 30 FPS game. And also, you can't buffer button presses with the brush, only button releases. So we have to do most of the inputs manually, and they're still frame perfect. However, we can still use the brush to time when we release our jumps. The way jumps work in this game is that the longer you hold jump, the higher Ami goes, similar to Mario Bros. And we actually don't want to jump too high there because we'll hit the ceiling if we jump too high, and that will cause Ami to lose all her speed and not be able to make it across. So we actually have to jump just long enough so that we have enough distance, but not too long that we hit the ceiling, which ends up being frame perfect twice over. Here is Queen Himiko. We talked to her a couple times, and in addition to being the queen who's neglecting her people who are all dying of a terrific plague, very thematic, very timely. So everyone in Seon is dying of a plague, but she's not helping them. because she assumes we'll do it, but we're not going to do it either because that would take about 20 minutes, and we don't have that much time. So instead, she just gives us the border key to go to North Ryoshima Coast. And we're just going to ignore all the people in Seon. We will never save them because it's just too slow. The entirety of Seon remains in this cursed state for the rest of the run. Then here we just run into the guards. They throw us out because we're not supposed to be inside, so they just toss us out. And we can then run directly out of Seon back to North Ryoshima Coast. Here's the room of Rao. That's Rao. Goodbye, Rao. That's the only time we're going to see her for a very long time. Normally we'd have talked to her multiple times and gone through a whole mini dungeon with her, but we skip all of that. And you can see here the bridge is still down because we never raised it. And then, I didn't point it out earlier, but as we run back through Seon's commoner's quarter, you'll notice that all of the people are just hunched over, lying on the ground, dying, because we're not helping them. Like, there's just this terrible mist everywhere. People are collapsing. It's really awful, but, you know, we don't have time for that. We're after the big bad, the big cheese, not any small fry that are like the demon that's making the mist. So now that we have the border key, all we need to do is present it to these border guards over here. In theory, if we could jump over this gate, it would save a bunch of time, basically all we did in Seon. But there's no way to do that without the KT glitch, so instead we have to do all those hard tricks to get around it. And this is North Ryoshima Coast. Now you'll notice North Ryoshima Coast, unlike every area I've been to up till now, is not cursed. And that's because Waka has gotten so impatient that he just decided to uncurse it for us. Because we took over an hour to get here. It's kind of ironic that he gives that line, since, you know, we're doing the best we can, Waka. But no matter how fast we get here, he is always faster, just like the running man. So after that scripted fight there, we actually used our very last item. Our inventory is completely empty, so we are due for a shopping trip. And this one gives us a few necessities for the rest of the run. There are going to be a few more shopping trips, but they're all going to be pretty much the same. So we get a fish feed bag here, guess what that is for, and a few more steelfish sake. And then here we're going to activate yet another fast travel point. It's been a while since we gotten one of those, but this is the only one we'll be getting, or one of the only ones we'll be getting, on the other side of the river that we crossed during city checkpoint skip. Then we run over here. This is just a hard requirement. We have to go to this guy, Urashima, who's getting beat up by some kids. And then he tells us how to summon Orca, who is the envoy of the Dragonians, who are a race of people who live at the bottom of the ocean and have the power to control the water dragon, who is terrorizing Seon City and the Sea of Japan. But instead of taking us directly to the Dragonians, he's actually going to make us like pass a trial, sort of. We have to unlock the portal to the Dragon Palace. And the first part of that is we have to obtain another brush technique from this place, Catcall Tower. So we're going to take Orca over to Catcall Tower, since he swims a lot faster than we do, and can't be killed by the water dragon, who would otherwise eat us if we tried to swim ourselves. And now we're inside Catcall Tower. Now, obviously, Catcall Tower is kind of infamous, even casually, for being a very bizarre area, and you can see why. The camera shows it here. It's an incredibly tall tower, and the sides are covered with climbable walls. Here we do a technique to skip a fight, but then after that we just jump straight onto the tower, and you're going to see here, I do a very strange rhythm. I'm actually double tapping the button to stick to the wall and then immediately jump off of the wall. And then I double jump back onto the wall in order to get more height without having to touch the wall again. And this is pretty much the optimal way to climb the tower. And because the climbable walls aren't all the way around the tower, they actually have a pattern to them, we have to move around sideways as we climb up the tower. This is basically 2 minutes of pressing the jump button about 200 times, so it's quite a workout. I've actually used the Switch's built-in button remapping feature in order to bind one of my shoulder buttons, the right trigger actually, to jump, so that I can alternate between that and the face button jump. You saw there I landed on a cloud platform. That's to avoid a cutscene at the top of the tower. If you climb up the tower in one try without landing on those platforms, the game will spawn a chest as a reward for you, but the cutscene of spawning the chest takes longer than Isun's dialogue for landing on the cloud platform, so we just land on the platform instead. And we actually use it to do a bit of fast movement, since running on the platform is faster than moving sideways on the tower. Here we jump up the spiral staircase. Believe it or not, it took until this year to discover that we could just jump up the staircase instead of going all the way around. It saves like 10 seconds. It's kind of stupid. No one thought of that for like 14 years to do that in a speedrun. And then here's the cat. The cat. The special cat. This is why we had to press the jump button 200 times. And we have to feed it a fish. And then feeding it a fish makes the brush gods look upon us kindly. So they bestow upon us a new brush technique called Catwalk. And Catwalk is very basic. It lets us make those climbable walls anywhere that there's a cat statue. So here's one such cat statue. Now, you might not have seen any of these up to this point, but we've already passed a couple. We just draw a line from the statue onto the wall, and it makes those climbable patterns on it. Now, this is one of those abilities that isn't hard checked for anywhere. However, there's 3 different places where we need to use it that we cannot skip it. One of those places we technically can skip, although it's an incredibly precise trick that would take a very many attempts to do. However, it's useless to skip it there without being able to skip it in the other 2 places. So, unfortunately, we still have to obtain Catwalk in this category. Now, we're not going to progress right away, because if you remember earlier, there was 2 more dogs that we were supposed to find for Princess Fusei, and we completely forgot about that. Unfortunately, we can't actually skip it. The game does hard check for a brush technique that we don't have, and it requires that we fight all the dogs in order to obtain it. So instead we're going to go over here, and you might be asking, wait, what does this have to do with the dogs? Why is Susanoo here? Really, there's no particular reason for it. This is part of a totally unrelated subplot, part of the first chapter of the game. So we went from the middle of the second chapter to the middle of the first. But unfortunately, we're required to do that QTE in order to make the Canine Tracker appear so that we can fight the next dog. And we can't do this any earlier. Unlike in Sasa Sanctuary, the game does check that we have the Canine Tracker here, so we can't do this one early. Then here's Kokari again, so this is going to be the second and final time that we do fishing. So once again, random shadows, just pull hard to one direction and power slash the fish. Very simple. Just a little bit of downtime in the run. Overall, this run is quite action-packed, since we can skip almost every cutscene, and there's no cutscene that's unskippable longer than like 20 seconds. So this game is just constant action, but there are some times where there's just not as much happening on the screen, like when we're dashing for long distances, or when we're fishing, and you know what to do during downtime. So this fish is different. It actually has to be power slashed twice. And there are other fish that have to be power slashed 3 times, but we don't have to fish for them because we're done with all the fishing in the rest of the run. Like I said, there is actually another required fishing segment, but we skipped it. That was the one in Seion with Benkei, the swordsman. So there's other people we can fish with besides Kokari, and this gives us another brush technique. This is Crescent. This is one of those techniques that technically isn't hard required anywhere, but we automatically obtain it in the process of doing the dog side quest, which is required. So there's nothing we can do to avoid this brush technique, and it does help us in a couple places. It's basically the counterpart to sunrise in that it lets us turn it to night instead of day. It's kind of surprising how long the game lets you go, having only the ability to turn it to day, but not to night. And this is Ume. This is actually a dog that we saved earlier in the run, in the story. This dog was trapped inside Tudor ruins, but we rescued him. But now we have to fight him. The pink dog. So after fighting Ume with the same strategy as the other dogs, just Steel Fist, Sake, Cherry Bombs, we're going to use our double jump ability that we're not supposed to have this early in the run to do some slightly optimized platforming. Double jump doesn't help as much as you'd think in the early areas, but there are a couple places we'll see where it does save a fair amount of time. So then we're just going to go back to Shinshu Field, because guess what? The final dog is way back where we started, Kamiki Village. Now, you will remember, at the very start of the run, about an hour ago now, we did a turnip digging minigame with Mushi's mom and Mushi, and that's because Hayabusa is actually Mushi's guard dog. So Hayabusa will not recognize us as a worthy opponent until we've beat his turnip digging record, which is 9 of 10 turnips. So by digging up all 10, he will recognize us as a worthy opponent and will be willing to fight us. He also requires that we fight at night so that Mushi isn't around. But it conveniently gets set to night after we do the Ume fight because we use Crescent in the Crescent tutorial. And then once again here, the Canine Tracker appears. And here's Hayabusa. Hayabusa is actually a bit different from the other dogs. He has the most abilities, but also his arena has 2 patches of grass in it, and strangely, if you draw a cherry bomb in grass, the cherry bomb will automatically detonate, which can be used to make the fight a little bit faster, but I accidentally cut the grass here. What I was trying to do is power slash Hayabusa, because what he did is an attack that gives him super armor, which he actually just did again. But whenever Hayabusa has super armor, obviously the cherry bomb doesn't work. However, you can power slash him to cancel the super armor immediately. So what we could have done is power slash him just before the cherry bomb exploded, which would have made him get hit by it. But unfortunately I missed my power slash a couple times, which required me to wait until my ink recharged, which it does automatically, and that slowed down this fight by a lot, so I lost a lot of time here. About 20 seconds versus the optimal fight strategy. All the dogfights are kind of notorious for being somewhat RNG. Technically, you can respond well to pretty much any pattern they can throw at you, but if you mess up even slightly, then it can go way out of whack. So it's very much so a skill-based RNG factor. Here I'm actually going to use Crescent, and even though it's already night, what I'm trying to do is make it so that it stays night, in order to avoid a day-night transition from occurring later. And then here we go to a Devil Gate. This is actually the first, this is going to unlock the first fast travel point in the run, or in the game. We skipped doing it earlier because if we tried to do it earlier, it would have cost extra movement to get to this Devil Gate, and Isun would have given us a tutorial over how Devil Gates work. Which he doesn't do if you skip all of the Devil Gates in Shinshu Field. So by putting off unlocking this fast travel point until just now, we actually save about 10 seconds overall. And because it's an early game Devil Gate, the enemies are all pretty basic, just Yellow Imps and Green Imps. And so here's another Mermaid Spring. And we're going to use this to teleport back to Taka Pass. So the whole reason we needed to find all 8 canine warriors is because each of them possesses a so-called Satomi power orb. And we need the Satomi power orbs, all 8 of them, to form a key into the next dungeon. which is actually supposed to be the second dungeon in the sequence. We've technically already skipped 2 dungeons, but they're actually the third and fourth dungeons, and then there's also the mini dungeon that we skipped, which is between the third and fourth. So we're never going to do the third and fourth dungeons in this run. So now we are back at Kusa Village. Our only objective here is to run to the end, but we can do a bit of optimal movement now that we have a few more abilities. So we can use Vine here to skip some movement. This doesn't save much time, but it is optimal as far as we know. And we have double jump, so we can actually cut a corner across this raised bridge. And then we just go to Princess Fusei's dojo. And this is Fusei. So by talking to her, she gives us the Satomi Power Orbs, or well, the Satomi Power Orbs bestow themselves upon us. And that gives us the key we need to enter the next dungeon, Gale Shrine. Now, you might be asking, well, if we can skip the third and fourth dungeons, why can't we skip the second? And that's because the second dungeon contains a required brush technique in the middle of it. However, what we'll see later on is that we actually can simply leave the dungeon as soon as we obtain the power, which is not true of every dungeon, but this is one where it aligns that we don't need to defeat the boss, but we also can leave it early once we have what we need from it. This may remind you of, for example, Twilight Princess's Frozen Mansion, where they obtain the ball and chain and then leave. It's basically the same deal. So now that we've opened the way into this shrine, we're going to go in here. Now, technically speaking, the reason why we have to do all of those dog questy things is just so that we can unlock a certain loading zone that lets us get from one area of this map to the other. So we can actually get onto this map early. The game just lets you do it casually, but there's nothing you can do there because it's just the entrance area. However, if we could get out of bounds in this map without touching the ground, we could actually do a trick called Origin Warp, which would teleport us into the middle of the dungeon. And that's exactly what's done in New Game Plus, where you have an infinite jump that lets you get out of bounds without touching the ground. Unfortunately, there's no way to get out of bounds at all in this category, so there's no hope for such a similar skip in New Game. So you can see there we have a key, and I actually tossed it a couple times. One interesting thing about keys specifically is that unlike other held items, they'll respawn in your mouth if you drop them, and then they despawn after a couple seconds. So we can use that to get in a few barks as we carry the key from one place to another. This here is an elevator that is powered by explosives. Don't ask me why someone decided to put this in their, Shinto shrine, but that's where it is. And then we're going to fight an enemy here. We did fight it earlier. This is a Chimera. They're pretty basic enemies. They're similar to Bud Ogres in that you have to make them vulnerable before you can hurt them. But unlike Bud Ogres, you can just hit them a bunch, and a Cherry Bomb happens to qualify as hitting them a bunch. So we just kill them with 3 Cherry Bombs, and it's very simple. So both of these Chimera are guarding a key, and we can use the key to get up to the top of the dungeon. So unfortunately we have to raise the bridge, or the elevator twice in order to achieve this. And once at the top here, we have the Lockjaw. Kill it. And it lets us through. Then we just have this spiral ramp. And we are now at the top of the windmill that makes up the center of this dungeon. It is called Gale Shrine for a reason. So going through here, we can see that there are some cursed winds, which are the source of all the evil in Kusa Village. The winds themselves have been corrupted by the boss of the dungeon, Crimson Helm. So by simply blowing the wind in the opposite direction of the cursed winds, we can dispel them, cancel them out, and restore the good air to Kusa Village. Now, of course, the source of the evil, Crimson Helm, we're going to completely ignore him, because we don't have to fight him. Normally, what all that fighting Crimson Helm does is it triggers the sequence to unlock the third dungeon, Moon Cave, where Orochi is. But since we're skipping Orochi and the Moon Cave, we don't need to even fight Crimson Helm. And then right here, after this cutscene, we're going to do the first and only really major skip that requires double jump here. So we're at the top of the dungeon, really high up technically, and we can get over this invisible wall here by doing a tackle bounce, and that lets us fall all the way back down to the middle of the dungeon, or to the bottom. And conveniently, there's a bridge that we land directly on top of, just because of how the dungeon is laid out. And that saves about 20 seconds while leaving the dungeon. Very helpful trick. And then, here's a funny thing. In English, this text box here says, it's a dialogue from Isun where he says, "We can't just ignore Crimson Helm forever," and then you just choose to ignore him. So that's why the split is named like that. Just a funny quirk. So having our new ability, the brush technique that we use to deflect the evil winds, Gale Storm, this is the brush technique that is hard checked for. There's actually two different points in the run where there's no way to substitute it. Unlike Inferno, where we can substitute it with Fireburst, that infinity sign ability that we obtained earlier, there's no way to get a substitute for Gale Storm. The upgraded version of Gale Storm can't be obtained without it, and even if it could be, it doesn't actually have the same effect. So, having Gale Storm, we're going to leave Gale Shrine, leave Kusa Village, so they still have to deal with that Crimson Helm guy, which is actually like this enormous six-legged bull demon. So, you know, have fun with that, guys. And now that we've obtained everything we need from the first chapter, we're going to go back to the second chapter and continue where we left off with the Dragonians and the Dragon Palace. So here we're going to make use of that fast travel point, that Mermaid Spring in North Ryoshima Coast, to avoid having to do city checkpoint skip a second time. So over there is a merchant, and we've actually shopped with him once before, but we're going to do it again. We have to buy a few exorcism slips, and we also have to sell the fish that we fished up before Ume. I actually mess up the menu here. I accidentally exit the shop without buying what I wanted, so I have to do it again. Just a minor mistake. So all we're getting here is 3 large exorcism slips, and if it wasn't already obvious what we use those for, we're going to use those to cheese some fights. Here we can do a precise jump over the water to get over it without having to swim. And then here we're going to use our first of 3 required uses of Catwalk. Technically 4, but 2 of them are the same. And then we use Crescent. So this is to turn it night, because we need it to be night right here. So this is one of the few actually helpful uses of Crescent. And then we go to this guy. This is a guy with a telescope. He's the Watcher. And when we draw a star there, it's a shooting star with our brush. And he wishes upon the shooting star to make the spiral galaxy appear, the Whirlpool Galaxy. And so, now that the Whirlpool Galaxy appeared, we use Gale Storm, and I accidentally used Sunrise here because, you know, brush recognition. And using Gale Storm here on Earth, way over in Japan, for some reason causes the Spiral Galaxy to spin at an incredible speed. And for some reason that then causes the whirlpool in the ocean to open. And that is the portal to the Dragon Palace. And then it turns to day, because of the sunrise I drew. So we just jump off of Watcher's Cape here, And we're going to go to Orca, because we can't get into the whirlpool without Orca. It'll just spit us out. So we need him to take us through. Which makes sense, since he's the envoy of the Dragonians. Here we're actually mashing B, just like when Ami swims. You can mash B. You can mash the jump button when Orca swims in order to make him swim a bit faster. It's not as important to have a good rhythm there because he has a lot more inertia than Ami, but it still helps. And this is the Dragon Palace, just an inn under the ocean. We can breathe, not really explained how, but Ami's a sun goddess, so. And I guess it's no big deal for a goddess. It doesn't really explain why Isun can breathe underwater, but I guess bugs, are much better at absorbing oxygen than large animals are, so it's forgivable. Isun is actually a bug-sized swordsman, but same deal. So this is the Queen of the Dragonians, Orahime. She actually has a Kepera Gebera dialogue at the start. We have to select the second option in order to skip her dialogue, and I accidentally pressed the first one. Fortunately, we can skip the dialogue, so it's not nearly as painful as talking to Kepera Gebera. So having talked to her, she's going to order us to do a hit job on her husband. Pretty much. So in the water dragon, which was terrorizing Japan, is in fact the husband of Orahime. He has simply transformed into a massive serpent. Nothing surprising. So we're just going to jump into his mouth, because for some reason he's sleeping right here. Not really explained why. None of this makes any sense. But here we are, we're inside the dragon. Believe it or not, this is actually supposed to be the second time you go inside another living creature during a dungeon. But, we skipped the first one. I'm not going to explain which one. Here there are some Demon Scrolls. Like I mentioned before, Demon Scrolls will chase you in the overworld. Or they'll chase you inside dungeons, regardless of the time of day outside the dungeon. So we have to do some stuff to avoid them. Here I sort of mess up my platforming and I fall into the water. This loses a few seconds, but it's not a huge deal. Just some minor time loss. Normally we can avoid the scrolls, but sometimes they spawn in bad locations. And so they get in our way when they try to chase us. So we have another lockjaw key here. And we're just going to bring this through. Now you might get a bit of deja vu here. This dungeon is actually partially a reskin of of Hana Valley. I actually dropped the key accidentally, believe it or not, and so I had to wait for the key to respawn in Ami's mouth, and because we were already in front of the lockjaw, it just instantly triggers the cutscene. So this is the Water Orb, the legendary artifact which gives the water dragon its power, and our objective is to retrieve it. Now, obviously it has incorporated itself into the anatomy of the water dragon, so taking it is a bit of a violent process. And that starts here. This is the stomach acid of the water dragon. So we are going to use Water Spout to drop this acid into that membrane there. And if we do that 3 times, with careful timing, because it doesn't let you do it all at once, that releases a bunch of acid, which floods the water dragon. And just like the acid is corrosive to the water dragon, is corrosive to Ami, so it is actually going to damage us as we swim through it. And in fact, it would actually kill us. We don't have enough health to swim through this water. However, by using the inner camera, we can actually use the acid on the water orb from a farther distance than intended, which lets us break open the water orb without having to swim all the way through the water. And this is actually really important, because like I said, we would literally die if we tried to do it otherwise. Unless we had a healing item, and the healing items in this game are called Holy Bones, So we used to use a holy bone during that segment, but I found a way to skip it, and so the trick for skipping the holy bone is called boneless. Just a fun fact. This is a sort of mini-boss. These are the tube foxes. There's 8 of them in 3 phases, and that is what the 3 large exorcism slips are for. And they give us a lot of money. So having defeated the tube foxes and taken the water orb, the water dragon is now literally dying because it can no longer sustain its energy. And that means that there's acid falling from the ceiling, and the acid is actually random, so it can hit us at any point here. And we have to hope that it doesn't hit us while we're flying through the air there, because if it does, it cancels our momentum and we just fall into the water. And there's a solid chance that we might drown at that point, which would lose a lot of time. So it's very lucky that we did not get hit by it, but you know, I would say it's like a 2 in 3 shot at getting through unscathed. So the odds are in our favor, but it's still an unfortunate bit of RNG. We call it the RNG acid. So yeah, having gone through the water dragon boneless, we now have to inform Queen Orihime that her husband has died. But in so informing her, we actually learned that one of the other things inside the water dragon was the fox rods, which have now been stolen by Rao, who's the lady that we skipped way earlier in the run and then ran past for like a second. So I can forgive you if you don't remember her, but oh yeah, this is just a random thing that happened. So Rao is actually, believe it or not, evil. And Rao has actually stolen the fox rods, which are the source of immense power. So she's now becoming an incredibly powerful demon. And so we have to chase her, which is why we have this exciting chase music going on. So for some reason, Isun won't let us use fast travel during this segment, even if it would save time. So we have to go through manually. But we're going to be running all the way across Ryoshima Coast, which we haven't done before since we teleported across it earlier. And instead of going directly into Seion City, since the front entrance has been blocked because of the emergency, we're going to go around the back into Seion City through a secret tunnel. So just some horses here. I have to be careful here I don't go to the right, because the fight trigger that we skipped earlier is still there, and if we run into it, it will trigger, which would lose like 30 seconds. So I have to go to the left slightly. You could see briefly there to the right, there was one of the mini dungeons we skipped. And then it turns out that the secret target of Evil Rao's ambitions is actually Queen Himiko, the Queen of Japan, who we met briefly earlier, who was ignoring the plague on her people. So Rao is going to go kill Evil Rao is going to go kill Queen Himiko. That is the ghost of the real Rao, who Evil Rao is impersonating, and she's leading us through a secret tunnel in the cliff here into this well. And this is the tunnel. So going through here takes us to Queen Himiko's palace. We can't use this any earlier, unfortunately. There's no way to clip into the tunnel. But it is here for us now. So here is the palace. And you'll remember we had to jump over the lava before, and it was like this multiple frame perfect input trick. We have to do that again. This trick is called Fire Tablet Skip, and part of the reason why we call it the hardest trick in the game, like in any category, is the fact that we have to do it twice. So in addition to being this insanely precise trick in terms of timing, it's also, you can't just like grind runs until you get it first try. You have to get it first try twice, which means you have to be consistent. So here I do a position setup, and then I use the brush to align Ami's paws. so that I can get a certain running position to start with. The first jump is actually so precise in terms of positioning that it's actually sub-frame perfect. The only way to make even possible for you to do that input is to start with a position setup so that Ami is along a certain distance, in a certain distance range from the edge. Here we do our one and only wallet upgrade in the run so that we can get all the money from Evil Rao. Evil Rao is very similar to Waka and the dogs in that she's very vulnerable to explosives, which makes sense because she's literally a demon wearing like a cat mask or a fox mask. So, you know, a canine basically, a human crossed with a canine, which makes her double vulnerable to cherry bombs. She actually gave me a really bad pattern there. She has two different things she can do after getting hit by a cherry bomb. One of which is an invincibility dodge roll, and the other of which is an attack that makes her vulnerable for the rest of the fight. So you can guess which one she chose to do 3 times. Here we actually have to jump over the lava backwards. And it turns out that the reverse fire tablet skip, jumping over backwards, is actually not nearly as precise as the forward one. And it might not be obvious why, but it just has to do with the alignment of the walls that divide up the lava. That the timing when jumping backwards is just much more lenient. Which is convenient, because otherwise we'd have to do a multiple frame perfect trick 4 times in the run instead of just twice. It is still pretty hard. It's easy to mess that up and fall into the lava going backwards, but it's not so bad. We don't have to use a setup for it or anything. So you can see here Rao has disappeared from her perch, so she's no longer sitting there because she's come out as evil. And Waka is still standing here. Waka is supposed to disappear way earlier in the story, but he just stands here for the rest of the game because we never hit the trigger that makes him go away. So anyway, the story-wise, what happened there is we found out that Evil Rao did kill Queen Himiko. However, Queen Himiko used her dying breath, or actually her dead breath, in order to reveal to us the location of Evil Rao's secret base, which is actually Oni Island. Here we're going to go to this shop really quick, and that's to pick up even more Exorcism slips, and this is our biggest purchase so far. We're going to get a whopping 8 Exorcism slips, and the reason why we do it now is because now is the first time where we have just that much money, because the 2 latest fights we did gave us 40k each, and each of those Exorcism slips costs 10k yen. So once again, we are in a rush to reach Oni Island before sundown, when it's actually a mobile island, so it'll literally teleport if it turns night. So we have to get there in time, but obviously it's scripted, so we get there in time. Here is the second required use of Catwalk. If we could skip this particular use earlier, we could obviously do it again. So it's technically only 3 different places where it's used, but one of those places, which is here, it's used twice. And we'll get into what the other 2 uses are later. So here, at the end of Watcher's Cape, will be Orohime. Orohime will use the power of the water orb to transform into a giant dragon. Basically another water dragon, since she can do the same thing her husband did. And unlike her husband, she's not going to attack anything. She's just going to become a bridge. So we're walking across Orohime's back right now on a living bridge. And then here is actually supposed to be a required usage of Inferno, one of the only places where Inferno can't be substituted with Fireburst. We're supposed to use the fire tablet in order to stand on the lava there, and then make a lava pillar in the same way that we make a water spout pillar. However, we can't do that, so instead we have to do a precise jump off of Orohime's forehead. So this is called the forehead jump. And unfortunately I messed it up there, which is a pretty slow... This is one of the slower tricks to mess up, because Isun has some dialogue if you do. But I got it there, so we skipped Inferno. And then here we're going to get out of bounds. There's a low invisible wall here, which we can just clip over. And then now we're on the exterior of the volcano. So Oni Island is actually a dungeon made up of like 4 or 5 different maps, but conveniently the start and middle of the dungeon are on the same map because they're both on the exterior of this volcano. So by simply getting out of bounds and then jumping around the exterior of the volcano, we can get halfway through the dungeon, or like roughly halfway through the dungeon, right away. Now this is a lot of platforming we have to do, and the slope we're running on is actually extremely slippery. So we constantly have to jump to make sure we don't slide too far down the volcano and into the water. Because if we landed in the water, we'd actually just have to drown and start the whole trick over again, because we have no way of getting out of the water since we skipped Water Lily at the beginning of the run. So over there is our target, the tiger statue. We're not actually going to get back inbounds. Instead, we're going to use the cutscene for this statue for restoring the arrow on its back in order to teleport ourselves back inbounds. And the statue also happens to give to us an essential brush technique, one that is not skippable, which is Thunderstorm. So this is basically Water Spout for electricity, in the same way that Inferno is Water Spout for fire. So we have to wait for the thunder to strike here, and then we bring it to this sword switch thingy, this lightning rod. And we can use that to activate that door and then this spinning bridge here. Now one interesting property of the spinning platforms in this dungeon is that they don't have a bottom, so you can jump through the bottom and clip onto the top. And then having done that, we go directly into the interior of the dungeon. And there's an explodable floor here, which brings us quite neatly to the introduction of this mechanic. These are electric switches, a key part of the dungeon. Or electric keys, I mean. So when we're holding this electric key in our mouth, these platforms become solid. It doesn't make much sense. You'd expect them to just electrocute you, but instead we can run across them. Because magic. And here we have to use Vine. I actually mess up this Vine. I don't draw it far enough. The hitboxes for Vine can be kind of finicky. And then we use the electric key as an electricity source for Thunderstorm. We run around a fight here. This is one of those fight skips that's just as simple as running around it. And then we have a paper door maze, but the maze is always the same, so we just look cool running through a bunch of paper doors since we know exactly how to get to the exit. And then here's a scripted fight. So this one's pretty simple. These are actually an enemy we would have seen earlier. These are poltergeists, but we skipped the first time we're supposed to encounter them. And then we bring the electric key finally to its destination, this gearbox thingy. And that unlocks this door. So this room is actually, we're supposed to be able to access this room way earlier, but we have to take a huge detour around the dungeon, and that's what we skip by doing the thing where we climb around the volcano. And then we can blow up the statue with electricity for some reason, which reveals a staircase. We actually made sure to use Thunderstorm there before we hit a cutscene trigger, which would have done a big camera pan over the statue. As long as you blow up the statue before you hit the trigger just doesn't work. And then here's some eye switches. So once we get into here, it's actually a trap. So we actually have to power slash these eye switches. Except I missed one, and there's one behind us. So if we power slash all 5 of them, that lets us go right on through. Not a very good security mechanism. And then this brings us to the so-called side-scroller segment. This is an interesting platforming segment because there's a bunch of cycles that we have to hit. And unfortunately, spoiler alert, I do mess it up in a couple places, so we don't get the optimal cycles. So here what I'm doing is an attempt to beat a cycle. But unfortunately I was too late when I got to here. So you can use Power Slash on these rotating bridges in order to stop them in place. And I actually fall down here, which loses even more time. I attempt to stop it again, but I miss. So I do a few backup strats in order to get back up, but obviously I lost a bunch of time just to messing things up there. So you can actually land on these bridges even when they're almost diagonal, as long as you're precise about it, which I had to be there to make it on time. The platform here is quite sloppy, but obviously, with practice, this segment becomes incredibly smooth. So here we're forced to wait again for the spiky bridge to pass and let us through. And that opens up this switch. And then we just skip these platforms there by using tackle bounces. So here we have to wait for these spinning discs to pass. Each one goes a bit faster than the previous one. And we can actually stop the top one in order to beat a cycle. And that's the side scroller. So I did lose some time there, but that's just because I made various mistakes that I could always correct. And this is one of my favorite segments in the run. And unfortunately, you're not going to see why, because I will mess this up here pretty badly. But it is still a cool segment. So this is the 4th through 6th floor of Oni Island. So we're intended to go through a bunch of things here in order to get to the end. However, instead what we can do, and I'm going to, again, mess this up, we can actually clip through the wall here and do a setup in order to get to the very end of this floor right away. So I clipped into the wall, and I'm trying to clip the camera in here as well. And unfortunately, I just barely mistime it, so I don't get clipped to the right side of the wall. What we're doing here is we're skipping 2 encounters with a character that we should have encountered several times up till now, named Toby. Toby is actually a cursed slip of paper, which has gained sentience, and is now the guard of Oni Island. However, he's not very good at his job because he actually wants to race us, so he's a true speedrunner. So he tries to race us like 7 different times throughout the dungeon, but we skip all of them. 2 of the times are on this floor, and after the last race, he actually dies. He commits dead because he's so like satisfied with our performance, but he can't bear to live for having failed his true duty as a guard. So yeah, you can see I messed this up several times, but it's fine since it gives me more opportunity to explain the trick. This trick really isn't that hard, but I was quite rusty for this run, so it's going to bite me somewhere. Basically, the idea here is we need to get into a certain position with Ami in order to have the vine have just enough speed to clip us through the ceiling. And then we can use the vine a second time to clip us through the floor onto this bridge here, and this brings us directly to the exit of the dungeon. So that split is named Long Live Toby because by skipping the final race, we actually skip Toby dying, which means we save him. So save the Toby. It is much faster to save him. It's about 18 seconds faster to save him than to kill him. But, you know, if anyone really wanted to kill them, I'm sure I could be bribed to waste a little time doing so. He is technically evil after all, even if he's a true speedrunner. And this brings us to Ninetales, the boss of Oni Island, who's actually the true form of Evil Rao, which starts with a constellation, because the whole idea of Ninetales is that Ninetales is trying to play as a god, but is actually a fake evil god, basically. So, Ninetales is sort of like Jalhalla from Wind Waker in that she's made up of 9 spirits, and we have to kill them all in 2 phases. And each of them is actually an enemy that we can kill. But fortunately we have Exorcism slips, which kill every enemy on the field. So we don't have to worry about it. And we can get a perfect cycle every time. There's, in each of the sets of 4, there's 2 special spirits, or 1 special spirit, 2 in total, which have a bit more health than the rest. So we need to hit them in order to kill the rest with just 1 Exorcism slip. And then once all of the spirits are gone, Ninetales just reverts to her one-tailed form and is directly vulnerable to Exorcism slips. And then we finish her off with a single cherry bomb. And that's the fight. One interesting thing is after each boss fight, the game offers for you to save. Obviously, because this game is timed by in-game time, we can't use or load saves during the run. So that doesn't save time. However, if you do accidentally open the save dialog, it's actually it's kind of bad because there's a very, very low risk, maybe like 1 in a couple hundred, that the game will crash when you close the dialog, and this is on all versions. However, obviously this wouldn't be a concern in like a marathon setting because you could just save instead, and the save works even if it crashes, and then you could just load the save afterwards. It's just for a real speedrun we cannot do that. And obviously you can always avoid this by simply making sure you always select that not to save. Anyway, after having defeated Ninetales and clearing Oni Island with Thunderstorm, we can now progress further in the game. And this brings us all the way back to Shinshu Field. So technically speaking, Oni Island is the end of the second chapter of the game, but there is a third, and that third takes place in the third major region of ancient Nippon, ancient Japan. This is actually the third time this run where I get caught by an optional fight, which normally I avoid all of them, but I was playing sloppy this day. So this is actually the second required use of Catwalk. This is the one that's skippable. We can technically get on top of that cat statue, but it's incredibly precise. So we avoid doing that. And then we use Thunderstorm, our newly acquired ability, to blow up this observatory thing here. And that unlocks the tunnel to Kamui, which is this game's name for what is basically Hokkaido. So just running through here, this tunnel is actually split up into 2 different areas. I guess to make it feel like it's a longer tunnel than it really is, because we're supposed to be going all the way through that strait from the main island to Hokkaido, or to Kamui. And here is where the single biggest time loss in this run goes to. So what we're trying to do here is, and I can take my time explaining this. This is a trick called Oki Skip. Now, normally in Kamui, as soon as you enter, Kamui is cursed, and the only thing you can access is this starting area here, where you're blocked from progressing further by a blizzard, and the only thing in the first area is a house, and inside that house is a character named Oki. Now, Oki is a very important character to the story. This is actually the first encounter we're supposed to have with him. And he's supposed to have this huge character arc over the entire third chapter, over the entire third of the run, or of the game. However, we are going to completely skip meeting him except for once. We will see him one time in this entire run, because we are going to skip every part of his storyline. So, yeah, unfortunate for him. The thing we do here to skip him is, well, the only reason we have to fight Oki is so that he'll let us through the blizzard tunnel, from which we can then blow up the mountain which is encasing the guardian sapling using an electric arrow from another character who we're supposed to have encountered multiple times up to this point. And then we could bloom the guardian sapling and uncurse Kamui. However, the guardian sapling is always there, encased in the mountain, and the only thing that prevents you from just blooming it right away is the fact that the mountain is there. However, what we're trying to do here is clip the camera through a corner in the ground in order to get it underground, and then we can do another brush adventure where we take the camera all the way from here to the mountain under the guardian sapling, and then we can bloom it from below, skipping all of the stuff I just talked about. And this saves over a minute. Unfortunately, I was very rusty on the setup for this, and the initial setup is very sensitive to your position. So I had the wrong starting camera angle, and that is what was causing me to fail this so many times. But here, I just got it successfully. So I then did it kind of sloppily because I was nervous about messing it up because I had taken so long to set up in the first place. But at this point, I had more or less resigned myself to the fact that this was not going to be a great run. In reality, this trick is not inconsistent at all. You don't normally lose as much time as I just lost on it. It normally goes incredibly quickly, and there's not even enough time to explain what's going on. So I'm kind of glad I had the time to explain that here. So you saw just how fast that was once I got it. So if I was really practiced, and I would be, this trick would be dead easy. I would get it first try every time. Anyway, once we've bloomed the sapling, we're now in real Kamui, healed Kamui I should say. And there is to our left a huge fight trigger for an enemy that we really want to avoid because it's very slow to fight, called the Igloo Turtle. However, by doing a very arcane setup, we can make this vine flower appear early, much earlier than intended. And it's very complicated to explain just how this trick works, so I literally cannot. In fact, we only a couple months ago figured out exactly how this flower works, and it still doesn't make any sense why it works that way. Before then, we were sort of just doing random things and hoping it would work, but now we have a consistent setup. So by using that flower, we can clip through an invisible wall, which sends us around the fight trigger and lets us skip that fight. Right there, I did a quick shopping trip to get 2 Infinity Stones. We haven't gotten any up to this point, but we could have gotten them much earlier. Infinity Stones basically just give you infinite ink for 1 minute. That's all they do. And that's going to be incredibly useful later on because there's going to be a couple points where we need to use a lot of brush techniques rapidly, and we don't have enough time to let the ink recharge, so we need to use an Infinity Stone to accommodate for that. This is Wepkir. This is the major settlement in Kamui. And the people here are actually these sort of like werewolf people. Oki's actually one of them, named Owina, and they have this gate over to our right there, and they're blocking us from progressing further until we solve their problems. However, we are not going to solve their problems because, unbeknownst to them, there's a back route around their massive gate, and that is by getting out of bounds here, we can actually clip through here. The collision here betrays what the textures are, so we're underneath the mountain here, but we're still climbing up. God knows why they decided to put collision here at all, but it's helpful for us. So we're actually going behind the village chief's house, Chief Kemu, and we're just going all the way behind it. You can see that there. There's an angry dialogue bubble there from the guy who's supposed to stop us from doing this. And then we can just clip back inbounds by finding an acute enough angle. And now we're through, and that's Wepkir Gate Skip. Clipping through walls is actually really rare in this game because, unlike in most Zelda games, the collision in this game is actually incredibly robust. It's very hard to clip through corners and stuff like that, even if they're really acute. Even then, the devs are very careful not to make acute angles pretty much anywhere with invisible walls and stuff. And a lot of the invisible walls are huge anyway. So, up to this point, almost all of the times we've been getting out of bounds, it's been by going over invisible walls rather than through them. But there, clipping back inbounds there is one of the few times where, but just because it's out of bounds, they didn't really care about the collision there, so they made a very acute angle, which lets us slip back inbounds. Here is actually going to be one of the most biggest and easiest skips in the entire game. This is Wepkir Gate Skip. A Waku Gate Skip. I'm sorry, Waku Early is technically the name of this trick. So, what we're supposed to do here, very hard to explain, we're supposed to open that gate, which involves doing a huge 30-minute side quest, which is where most of Oki's side story comes in, where we go 100 years back in time and fight the true form of Orochi, in order to rescue a girl named Lika, who can do an incantation to open the dungeon. However, by clipping out of bounds, not by clipping, by going over an invisible wall using a big vine jump, we can get behind the gate and just walk into the loading zone. And again, that saves 30 minutes, and it's not even hard. It's a massive skip. If you've played this game casually, you know just how much content we skipped right there. So not only did we skip the first encounter with Orochi in the Moon Cave, we skipped our second encounter with true Orochi 100 years in the past. And this brings us to Waku Shrine, which is one of the most broken dungeons in the game. We're going to be skipping almost all of it. And that starts by skipping the entirety of the first floor. Here we're going to abuse a cutscene which teleports Ami, which if you remember, we did this way earlier in the run in Kusa Village. We did a similar thing. So here's pretty much the one of only 2 required uses of Inferno, where we substitute it with Fireburst. So by using Fireburst, we can melt the ice there, and the game forgot to check whether that door was still locked, so it just teleports Ami through the door, which is convenient for us. And then here's the third and final required use of Catwalk. There's just no way up this wall. There's nothing to platform off of in order to get up here, so there's no way to skip it. And this is I think that technically the 3rd floor of Waku Shrine. So we can do some platforming there to avoid those spinning bridges. There's cannons shooting at us this whole time, but if we just run really fast, we never get hit. And here's the most interesting property of Fireburst. These are like fast-moving gears, where normally if we stood on top of them, it would hurt us, and we would just fall into the void. However, not only does Fireburst work as a substitute for Inferno, it serves as a substitute for Veil of Mist as well, because for whatever reason, Fireburst also has the property of slowing down time, just like Veil of Mist. Which makes it able to substitute for Veil of Mist, where otherwise that ability would be required. So that's how we skip both of those brush techniques. We get a 2-for-1, pretty much. So here's the second required use of Inferno, where we use Fireburst to melt the lever here. And there's sort of like a pattern here. I refresh my ink one last time in order to get by this a bit faster. There's a pattern there that you're supposed to know, but as long as you know it beforehand, you can just type it in without having to do the puzzle to learn it. And this gives us our final brush technique. This would be the last one in the story. So at this point, we're supposed to have all of them, but we skipped 3. Despite the fact that we don't have all of them, the game gives us this new weapon on our back called Solar Flare, which is supposed to be the culmination of our abilities for having all 13, or technically 15, major brush techniques. But again, we skipped 3 of them, so no big deal. And then here is one of the most major tricks that Giant Cookie Jar discovered. This is a trick known as Nechku Skip. So this dungeon has a whole middle portion after Blizzard, where we're supposed to fight the mid-boss, which is actually one of the final bosses in the dungeon, named Nechku. But instead, we can do some really precise platforming there to get to the final room, one of the final rooms in the dungeon, skipping all of that. Then we do the cannon room here. So we have to cross this void by making platforms in the air with Blizzard, which is the new ability we just got. Blizzard is basically Water Spout for ice. But unfortunately, I got a Power Slash. This is another one of those cases where brush recognition can mess up for no clear reason. You're not supposed to be able to get vertical Power Slashes, but you can. Here what I'm doing is I'm using the slowdown effect from Fireburst in order to make it possible to reflect the shots from these cannons. We only have to destroy the gold cannon, but all of these red cannons are actually firing 3 shots, 3 times as many shots at us. So we have to jump around dodging all of these cannon shots in order to reflect the gold cannon's shot and progress. And the red cannons are still there. So it's just a really tense segment where it's very easy to make mistakes. And get hit a bunch, and you can even die there if you're not careful. Now, one thing I mentioned at the very beginning of the run is that we have an Astral Pouch, which is an extra life. You normally have to fill the Astral Pouch by eating 200 units of food, which is a lot of food. However, we get a free fill of the Astral Pouch when we get in Fireburst, because the guy who we got it from is actually a chef, and we got it by helping him cook food, and so he gives us a ton of the food. So, and not only that, but that food actually also gives you 26,000 yen. So you get so much stuff just from that one side quest. You get a substitute for 2 different brush techniques, you get 26,000 yen, and you get a full astral pouch, which is an extra life. And then this is Oki. This is Oki's dog form. So he has a wolf and a human form. So he just sees us here. We're supposed to have gone on this like massive adventure with him where he like completely changes his worldview. He like grows from this vindictive person into a good guy. And we just completely skip it. Also, here's the final boss of the dungeon. That was it. So for some reason, the devs forgot to make just one of their like 6 bosses completely immune to exorcism slips. So every other boss, we have to make them vulnerable somehow before we can hit them with the slips. But for this boss, we can just use 5 of them right away and they die. It's incredible. And it's great because that boss is really slow otherwise. It takes forever to kill them. And then here's the final dungeon. And it's not even really a dungeon because it is basically just a boss rush. So this is the Arc of Yamato. I jump into the trigger there. And so the Arc of Yamato is supposed to be sort of the source of all of the evil that we fought up to this point. All of it came from here, and when this ship crashed into Nippon like 100 years ago or something, or like 200 years ago. And so all the evil is coming from here, and we finally like raised it from the frozen lake in order to get by it. So it's this arc is supposed to be it was supposed to be a savior from like an evil on the celestial plane. Anyway, this is a boss rush. That's all it is. So here's the first of the 5 bosses we're going to be fighting. This is actually a boss we were supposed to fight. All of them are, but this is one of the bosses we skipped. This is Blight. He's the one who's causing the horrible plague in Seon City. We're supposed to have Veil of Mist to defeat him, but fortunately, he does another attack that doesn't require Veil of Mist to make him vulnerable, and we just have to dodge the first one. You might be thinking, well, why don't you just use Fireburst as a substitute for Veil of Mist? Blight here is actually the only thing in the entire game that cares about the difference between Veil of Mist and Fireburst, so he won't respond to Fireburst's slowdown effect. But everything else is fine. So that's the first boss. That one was pretty easy. That's the only one we're going to be fighting without any exorcism slips, because if you noticed at the start of the dungeon we bought 19 of them, which is a lot. Here, this fight here is the last really like substantial time loss, or like place to lose time. It's the last tense segment, or truly tense segment in the entire run. Because this is Orochi. So, like I said before, we're supposed to have fought Orochi twice up till now. However, we haven't. The truth of the matter is, Orochi is one of the most complex and interesting fights in the entire game. Because he's the only fight that we really have no way of cheesing. Orochi is an 8-headed serpent, and we have to kill all 8 of the heads individually, because they all have health bars. And he actually has 2 different phases here. So we're going to start by making him drunk with the 8 purification sake in the ground there. And we only have to make 3 of the heads drunk twice. That's how the first phase goes. So what we do here is a very complicated setup to get 3 heads aggroed at once. You're supposed to only be able to aggro 1 at a time. But by doing that setup, we can get 3 at once. Just because of a quirk with how their like stalling behavior works when they do their attacks. And then the second phase here is very different. Instead of doing 3 at once, we're going to be doing 1 at a time, because this time there's nothing we can do to like get multiple angry at us at once. And instead, we only have to get each one drunk once, but we have to do it for all 8. So we're going to basically do a big circle all the way around Orochi. And all the time, while this is happening, fire is falling from the ceiling, and it's completely random where it falls. Normally we would be immune to the fire because we'd have the fire tablet, but we skipped that, so we actually have to really worry about the fire, because not only does it hurt you when the fire hits you, it also lights your tail on fire, which causes you to continuously take damage. So between all of the different things you have to keep track on this fight, it's incredibly easy to make a big mistake on the cycles for the heads, because it's actually really tight timing-wise. And it's possible to easily die, but fortunately I did not mess it up on this attempt. And you can actually jump on Oroshi's back at the end, and when he dies, you just fall onto an invisible ceiling. It's weird. Just a strange behavior. And so yeah, that was an incredibly smooth demonstration of Orochi. So after that, we're sort of in the clear. There's not much ways to lose more than like a few seconds in the rest of the run. So after that, we still have some more boss fights. We have 3 more, but 2 of these are going to be pretty much a pushover. This is the next one. This is one of only 2 bosses in the boss rush that we've actually fought before, out of the 5. This is going to be Spider Queen. Now, Arc Spider Queen is a little bit different from Spider Queen in Tsuda Ruins, in that she takes 3 vines in order to break open her abdomen. But other than that, she's very similar. And unlike before, when we had to use Power Slashes on her eyes to defeat her, we can just use Exorcism Slips. And because we have such overpowered Exorcism Slips and she's a weak boss, we can literally just kill her in 2 slips and she dies right away. So a very simple boss. Not much room for error. One thing you'll notice to me is for some of these bosses, I'm positioning myself in a certain spot on the map so that I end up next to where the like green warp will spawn. Unfortunately, unlike in Zelda games, if you stand where the green warp is, or where the blue warp is for Zelda, the game actually doesn't recognize that you're inside it, so you have to get out of the warp and then go back into it. So instead what we try to do is position Ami just on the edge of the blue warp, which is kind of hard, because, you know, we don't know, it's hard to get a visual marker for exactly where it'll spawn in some of these fights. Here I'm, like, timing my barks to the rhythm of the low health noise, just to make it a little less grating. This is another of the bosses we skipped, the last one. This is Crimson Helm. So, if you remember way back earlier, Crimson Helm is the boss we ignored at the end of Gale Shrine. So we went to Gale Shrine, we got Gale Storm, but then we just left the dungeon without fighting anyone. And this is who we were supposed to fight. Fortunately, with all the slips we have, he goes down very easily, but normally he's quite a challenging fight. So here's one of those cases where I was too close to the warp, so I was inside it technically. Even though I was just on the edge, it still counted as being inside, so I had to leave the warp and then go back in. And then here's the final boss of the boss rush. This is Ninetales. Much like Spider Queen, Arc Ninetales is quite similar to her Oni Island counterpart, except with a slight difference. The main difference being that her final phase is actually weaker. Only takes 2 Exorcism Slips to defeat instead of 4. But otherwise, the strategy here is going to be pretty much the same. Draw a Cherry Bomb in order to break her guard, and then use Thunderstorm in order to break her open into 4 spirits. And then once the spirits become vulnerable, we immediately use 2 Exorcism Slips to defeat them, and start collecting the yen from them as they die. And then rinse and repeat for the second half. Here I miss my Thunderstorm, so she almost gets her sword up, which would cause a cutscene to appear, but we avoided that. And then 2 more slips and she's down. So here we have a pretty good setup for standing on the edge of the blue warp, so I was able to get right on the edge there and just hit it right away without losing any time. So now that all of the refights, or first fights in our case, are over, the warp to the true final boss has opened, but we're not going to jump straight in, because guess what we're going to do? We're going to go shopping. So I'm sure you can guess what our strategy is going to be, based on what we're going to purchase here. Yes, we bought 42 Exorcism slips with all the money we earned from the bosses. So, to put it quite clearly, the final boss, the origin of all evil in this game, is Yami, who's actually a giant ball. So I'd like to believe that the annoying ball from the very start of the run that we said so many mean words about decided to get angry and it turned evil, and now it's this. And it decided to basically attack all of Japan. So this is why we hate balls. Or orbs, if you want to put it one way or another. So the story is that Yami, at the start of the fight in a cutscene, steals all of our brush techniques, and we have to beat it out of him. Or out of it, I guess. So instead of just attacking it normally, which would be slow and bad, we're going to just use a bunch of explosives, a bunch of exorcism slips, to just knock it to hell. We do have to use a couple brush techniques in the fight at scripted points, but for the most part, we're just going to be dealing damage using a ton of exorcism slips. Over and over and over in a specific pattern to minimize the number we need. And this fight takes place in 2 phases. The first phase is a pretty simple ball, and then the second phase is still a ball, but it like splits up into layers like a snake. But our strategy is very similar. Anyway, since this fight is effectively an auto-scroller, since we just have to wait to get every single brush power, there isn't much time to save or lose here. I will make note of one interesting detail about this fight, which is that even though we skipped 3 brush techniques, we actually do get them back during this fight, even though we never got them to begin with. So Inferno and Veil of Mist we can actually use in this fight, but they're not helpful, of course, since the fight is just one with explosives. So with my free time at the end of this run, seeing as there's not much better to do, I'd like to thank a bunch of the people who helped to make this run possible in the Okami speedrunning community. I first joined the community over a year ago now, in the summer of 2019, and when I joined, some of the people who welcomed me into the community were Sinri, Skyryan, Cinderdog, Cornchunks, Dadang Sudadang, Liriati, and Kaiserado. I also want to give shoutouts to some of our more recent runners who've been putting in a lot of work, even if they haven't topped the leaderboards yet. They haven't taken my record. They still, a lot of them have given me cool ideas for optimizations. A lot of them have just helped contribute to discussions, or just been inspiring to watch grow over time. And some of those people are Jester, Pop Rocks, Youngster Joey, Tinker Knight, iStream Snipe, MK Infinite, Raichu, Davey, and Astral, or Stray Beads. I want to thank Critical Sid, who was the world record holder when I first started running, and was very helpful and informative at the time, even if they've since become a very dedicated Sonic Heroes and Colors speedrunner, who has run at several GDQs since. I want to thank Kinnan, who does hold record in a couple categories in this game, and has always been helpful and encouraging in routing, thanks to his knowledge of pretty much every category in the game. I want to thank Tunakan, our resident Japanese runner, who's discovered a lot of the most important skips in the run, namely CC skip, City Checkpoint skip, and early Fireburst. And he's one of the most ambitious, he was at least one of the most ambitious runners of the game, really pushing strats that a lot of other people thought were too hard or impossible. And he is the one who had the world record when I first took it. I want to thank Giant Cookie Jar. Giant Cookie Jar really revolutionized the run in the couple months that he was running. He found like over 10 minutes of skips in such a short time, and I haven't even found 10 minutes in all the time I've been running. So he's really great. I want to thank What About Clyde. What About Clyde isn't a runner, but they were the first to successfully decompress the game's files from the PC version and give us a proper collision viewer, even if it was just by loading models into Blender. It was still incredibly helpful to see that collision for a lot of areas, and it is specifically what enabled us to really explore and discover Sasa early, which is the most recent major skip in this category. And finally, I'd like to thank Krino Teeter, who's the second place runner and has taken world record from me multiple times, for being a great friend and rival through this journey of growth. And I hope he'll have the opportunity to do that again soon. So for this final phase of Yami, it's very similar. With this inspiring music at our back, we just count to 12. We used 12 whole Exorcism slips, and that is the end. So let's see if you've been counting correctly, have you? And there is our rattle to signal our victory. And at that point, the only thing left is to mash through the final cutscenes of the game and the credits in order to bring up the final results screen, which is this. So this is why we time by in-game time. This, at the very end, the game gives you a timer, and it shows you how long you took to beat the run. So 2:19:56 is overall a quite good time. This is technically only the second run ever to be sub 2:20, even if it is a full 2.5 minutes behind the world record. But this route is about 3 minutes faster than the world record, so you can tell just how much time we have to save. And I'm sure the world record will be broken very soon if I continue running. Thank you all for watching, and enjoy.